Today shouldn't be too bad. We have two budget hearings, Kansas State Board of Indigent Defense and Abstractors Board of Examiners, and we will get started with our analyst with the Board of Indigent Defense Services.
Proceed. Hi, good afternoon, Chairman Anderson and members of the committee. My name is Molly Pratt, and I'm a fiscal analyst with the Legislative Research Department, and I will be presenting the budget request for the Board of Indigent Defense Services. And in the audience today is the Executive Director, Heather Cessna. She will likely be available to answer other questions that the committee might require more information for. So the Board of Indigent Defense Services, or BIDS, is tasked with providing and supervising constitutionally and statutorily required legal services for indigent defendants accused of felonies. BIDS fulfills this mission by overseeing a statewide system of public defender offices and by compensating assigned counsel when public defenders are unavailable. The agency also serves as a pass-through agency for funding for legal services for prisoners, a nonprofit corporation providing legal assistance to indigent inmates of Kansas correctional institutions. Attorneys who are classified as public defenders are employees of the state who work at one of the public defender offices located within the state. Attorneys who are classified as assigned counsel are either private attorneys who volunteer to serve on local appointment panels in each judicial district, or private attorneys who have accepted contracts from BIDS to handle felony cases in certain jurisdictions under negotiated terms. In 2024, the statute was changed to increase the compensation for assigned counsel from $80 per hour to a minimum of $120 per hour up to $140 per hour. The current hourly rate is set at $120. However, the BIDS board voted to increase that by $5 to a total of $125 per hour beginning July 1st, FY 2026. On page 2, you will find the analysis for fiscal year 2025. The 2024 legislature appropriated $61 million or $61.9 million in all funds for the agency. And this year the agency requests a total of $69.8 million in fiscal year 2025. Item 1 discusses the State General Fund reappropriation. The agency carried over $7.8 million in unspent SGF monies from fiscal year 2024 into the current fiscal year. Of this amount, approximately $300,000 was for capital defense operations due to capital hearings that were scheduled to take place last year but are being continued into the current fiscal year. About $492,000 was for assigned counsel vouchers due to an overestimate on the part of the agency as to how quickly it could pay the vouchers for assigned counsel. And finally, $7 million was appropriated for general operating expenditures. This amount is so large because of a $3.8 million reappropriation and one-time cost savings from fiscal year 2023 into fiscal year 2024. That was associated with vacant positions. However, the cost savings contributed to the reappropriation into fiscal year 2025 as there was a delay in the hiring process of attorneys and non-attorney staff at 2 new public defense offices, one in Kansas City, Kansas, the other in Pittsburgh, Kansas. The agency plans to utilize the reappropriated funds in the following ways. $2.3 million for expert fees and transcription costs, $2.1 million to transfer into the capital defense account, $1.7 million to transfer into the assigned counsel account, $600,000 to cover lease cost, $300,000 to lower the amortized cost of the lease space, and finally the remainder to pay for IT security related projects. However, the Special Committee on Legislative Budget removed the reappropriation in fiscal year 2025. Item 2 just states that the agency is not requesting any supplemental funding. Item 3 relates to the court fees and services. In fiscal year 2024, approximately $1.1 million was receipted to the Indigent Defense Services Fee Fund. Of that amount, the agency expended $987,988, and this resulted in the fund having a balance forward of $104,600. Expenditures from the fund go toward paying the cost and fees for court reporters and expert witnesses. And finally, item 4 discusses CLE workshops. In fiscal year 2024, about $8,000 was receipted into this fund. Of that amount, the agency expended $3,557, resulting in the fund having a balance forward of $10,869. And expenditures from this fund will go toward offsetting costs incurred by the agency for providing the CLE workshops. Does the committee have any questions on fiscal year 2025?
Any questions for the analyst on 25? Let's go to 26.
The analysis for fiscal year 2026 begins on page 5. And I'm sure you all, the committee already knows, but these numbers are being compared to the amount approved in fiscal year 2025 rather than the agency's request. So item 1 relates to public defender pay parity. In recent years, the legislature approved agency-wide salary adjustments to bring the salaries of all BIDS employees up to more competitive levels with similarly situated employees in other governmental agencies, such as the Office of the Attorney General. However, the agency notes that salaries of prosecutors in Kansas continue to outpace the salaries of public defenders by 28% in fiscal year 2024. The agency further states that in August 2024, employee well-being survey conducted by the board found that about 75% of responding public defenders had considered leaving the public defense sector in Kansas due to salary concerns. The agency states that they are concerned that future staffing losses could result in public defenders being so overworked that indigent persons in Kansas would not be able to receive an adequate legal defense. As such, the agency requests compensation adjustments for public defense attorneys to maintain adequate pay parity with prosecutors. Specifically, the agency requested an additional $6.7 million SGF to adjust the compensation of attorneys and other staff to reach better pay parity with their counterparts in the prosecuting offices. This would provide a 28% increase for public defense attorney salaries and an average of a 10% increase for non-attorney salaries. Item 2 relates to ethical caseloads. According to the agency, each trial level public defender in Kansas currently has an average caseload of about 157 cases. This means, per the agency, that if each felony warranted the same amount of work, a defense attorney could work an average of 13 hours on each of the 157 felonies assigned to them, which is 22 hours less than the minimum amount of time that should be spent on low-level felonies. As such, the agency requests an increase of $4.3 million SGF and 29 FTE positions for fiscal year 2026. This would be a 10% increase in the number of attorney and non-attorney staff to be placed in the public defense offices where they have the greatest need for additional staff. According to the agency, the vast majority of vacant positions will be filled in fiscal year 2025. The agency believes that the additional positions will allow public defense attorneys and defense staff to handle the volume of criminal cases charged by prosecutors while also meeting the ethical and constitutional requirements of maintaining appropriate caseloads. For item number 2, as well as item number 1, the Special Committee on Legislative Budget moved to delete those enhancement requests. And item 3 can be found on page 7. That just discusses all other adjustments, which totaled $246,334. These are mainly related to funding shifts. However, there wasn't an increase in the cost of rent for building spaces and a rise in court reporting fees, coupled with a decrease in expenditures for travel and lodging and other subsistence for the all other adjustments. And with that, I will stand for questions for fiscal year 2026.
So following what the governor did in 26, with the $4.8 million for assigned counsel, did the governor's office pretty much give that instead of the ethical caseload? So the governor just did not give the 29 FTEs, but still gave the funding. Is that correct?
I believe so. I left my paper. 1 second. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, would you mind repeating your question?
Yeah, so it looks like the agency asked for just under 4.3 million, which would have come with 29 FTEs. The governor did not fund that, but gave 4.8 million for assigned counsel, but looks like no FTEs attached. Is that correct?
I do not have the specific document in front of me, but my understanding is that that is correct, yes.
Any further questions from the committee? Okay. Thank you very much. Director? Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I have a presentation put together, so give me a second here. I will get my slides up if you want to hold on a second and I'll get logged in. Oh. All right, you want to share my screen? Thank you. All right. Chairman Anderson, members of the committee and legislative staff, thank you very much for having me this afternoon. I'm Heather Sussin. I'm the Executive Director of the Kansas State Board of Indigent Defense Services, or BIDS. Our board oversees the Kansas Public Defender System, and I'm here today to give you an overview of our budget, the shortages of counsel that we're experiencing, and a brief status report on the current crisis we're facing as a vital member of the Kansas criminal legal system. But first, for a few of those of you that may be new to the committee, I just wanted to give a quick little bit of background information. Since 1963, when in Gideon versus Wainwright, the United States Supreme Court held that the United States, under the 6th and 14th Amendments, had a constitutional obligation to provide criminal defense counsel to people accused of crimes but were too poor to hire their own attorneys. Kansas has strived to meet that obligation through our indigent defense system, which since 1982 has been done so in adult felony level cases through the Kansas State Board of Indigent Defense Services. Most people don't realize how big of an impact BIDS has on our criminal justice system. In fact, 84% of all adult felony level criminal cases in Kansas who are charged against men and women that are too impoverished to afford their own defense attorney require appointed counsel. And once found indigent by their presiding judge, BIDS provides counsel to each client in all of those cases. In 2024, that involved 26,417 cases. We provide that counsel through two sides of our public defense system. One is our public defender offices, which are in a handful of communities throughout Kansas and are staffed by our direct state employees. The other side of our program is our assigned counsel program, which utilizes local private defense counsel who agree to serve on panels of appointed attorneys and accept severely discounted rate for BIDS cases. Each judicial district in Kansas is required to have a local appointments counsel, appointment panel under our statutes and regulations. And currently, as Molly said, our hourly rate is $120 per hour. However, even at that rate, we are still at less than half the market rate for private legal services in Kansas and over $40 below the appointed federal counsel rate. Our public defender's offices are comprised of 289 full-time employees, and those include public defenders, legal assistants, investigators, social workers, mitigation specialists, and administrative assistants, as well as others. We have 20 offices across the state. That includes a central administration office here in Topeka, 14 regional trial level offices, an appellate office, and a number of capital offices as well. This chart illustrates some of the detail that I think you already have in your documentation from Molly, but it kind of illustrates where our employees are centered in the breakdown of where our funding is spent. One item that I particularly want to draw attention to is that the capital death penalty litigation spending makes up approximately 11% of our total budget expenditures, but we only have approximately 37 total capital or death penalty eligible cases that are currently active right now. So we spend approximately 11% of our budget on less than 1% of our total caseload. This is due to the significantly more costly requirements of death penalty litigation and in order to meet professional and ethical standards. There are currently 9 individuals that are held under an actual sentence of death in Kansas. While BIDS works with over 300 private counsel to handle cases from across the state at all levels of crimes on our assigned counsel program, few, if any, of those counsel actually take exclusively BIDS cases. This is due still to the relatively low rate of pay for BIDS cases and the fact that private counsel have to supplement their income with retained clients or non-BIDS appointment cases. And that therefore severely limits their availability to be able to take cases in areas outside of their jurisdiction in order to help us with some of our counsel shortages. And we have shortages of counsel everywhere. I was going to talk a little bit through some of these. I'll go through them pretty fast, but I can also answer any specific questions you have about these here when we get to the end of my presentation. But for instance, in Johnson County, which is one of the counties that is the most populated with attorneys in Kansas, it is the most populated attorney area in Kansas. We have had to help rebuild their appointments panel multiple times. This is an area where we have a public defender's office, multiple contract counsel, and the most attorneys in the state serving in that jurisdiction. But because of the number of cases that have been coming in through that jurisdiction and because of the specialty that it takes in order to serve on some of those appointments panels, we've had shortages of counsels multiple times in Johnson County where we've had to help them rebuild their panel in order to meet the level of cases that they have coming into that county. And in counties where there are fewer attorneys, those shortages get even worse. For example, in Riley County, we have such severe shortages of counsel that we're paying attorneys from Kansas City, Kansas, Wichita, and Lawrence to drive to Manhattan and take cases. This is in spite of the fact that the county is also covered by a public defender's office. In Sedgwick County, we have two trial level public defender's offices, a main public defender and a conflict public defender, as well as several contractors who take cases before anything ever gets to our panel attorneys. But there are such insufficient numbers of attorneys in those public defender's offices that we regularly exhaust the Sedgwick County panel of appointed attorneys and have to work with the judges to find counsel outside of Sedgwick County to accept cases. Similarly, in Shawnee County, we have the same problem. We have a public defender's office, a conflicts public defender's office, several contracts, but we regularly have to work with the judges to find additional counsel to even serve on their panel because we have so many cases, but we don't have enough attorneys in our public defender's offices to handle those cases. And our even when our public defender's offices are totally full, that would still be true because we don't have enough actual FTEs in those offices to serve those jurisdictions. And then we continuously have to supplement their panel with attorneys from outside of that jurisdiction. Even in places where it doesn't feel like a crisis yet, we still have problems that we know are coming down the pipeline. For example, in Leavenworth County, currently they do a pretty good job of having enough counsel on their panel to handle the number of cases that are coming through. They do not have a public defender's office in that area. They rely just on panel attorneys, but the majority of their panel is over the age of 55. So we're anticipating that within the next few years, we're going to start seeing some significant retirements that are going to substantially limit the number of attorneys we have available to take cases in those areas. Rural counties across the state are, of course, hit the hardest by these shortages. For example, according to the Kansas Supreme Court's Rural Justice Initiative report that came out in December, 53 of 105 counties have 10 or few lawyers in them. And of course, out of those attorneys, there are considerably fewer of those in rural areas who are qualified to take criminal defense cases specifically, particularly high-level cases. A third of all current Kansas attorneys are already over the age of 60. And as a result of these demographics, it's no wonder that we're having difficulty finding attorneys to travel hours and hours to accept cases outside of their normal jurisdictions in order to cover the volume of cases charged in Kansas. While our public defender offices cover counties with approximately 65% of the total number of criminal cases being charged in Kansas, our public defender offices are so understaffed due to insufficient numbers of FTEs to support those caseloads, such that they regularly have to temporarily refuse to accept cases or significantly modify the number of cases they can accept on a weekly basis in order to comply with constitutional and ethical standards of criminal defense representation. Just as a way of illustrating what the burden then becomes for our assigned counsel, This map shows you by county the number of cases completed by assigned counsel in 2024. This does not include public defender office cases. So for example, if you're looking at Harvey County compared to like Reno County, it looks like Harvey County has more cases than Reno County. That's because in Reno County, we have a public defender's office that takes approximately 760 cases a year in that jurisdiction. So that 310 that are left are just what the assigned counsel panel is taking. So when you look at this list of where these cases are coming from, you can understand why we're concerned with shortages of counsel. We have 2 public defenders west of Hayes on this map. Understanding the volume of cases that we cover and the outsized role we play in the larger criminal justice system will help you understand why the current crisis is so concerning. Simply put, Kansas does not currently have enough experienced, qualified, and available criminal defense counsel to meet the volume of cases currently being charged by local prosecutors across the state. The severe shortage of counsel manifests in several ways. First is the lack of staffing in our public defender offices. It is insufficient to meet our current caseloads. And as a result, the employees that we have there have insufficient time under the National Public Defender Workload Standards in order to provide the minimum constitutional standard of reasonably effective assistance of counsel under the Sixth Amendment. In Kansas, our public defenders have an average of 13 hours per case per attorney to handle a case. Under the workload standards, even for low-level felonies, they should have 35 hours per case per attorney. For high-level felonies, they should have 248 hours per case per attorney. When our public defender's offices cannot ethically staff their caseloads due to turnover or the volume of cases, or if a jurisdiction does not have public defender's offices, those cases then flow to our contract counsel or our assigned counsel panel attorneys. But we also have insufficient numbers of assigned counsel panel attorneys as well. We estimate that we need approximately 400 full-time public defenders in our public defender offices to staff our current trial level caseloads. At the minimum constitutional standard, we have 127 public defenders. We need approximately 200 full-time private attorneys accepting nothing but bids cases. We have nowhere near that many private counsel whose primary work is made up entirely of just bids appointments. As a state, we're struggling to live up to our constitutional obligations under the Sixth Amendment to provide counsel in every adult felony case that qualifies for an appointed attorney. As a result, there are delays in the appointment of counsel in jurisdictions across the state. Most local counsel are overwhelmed with caseloads that are in excess of national caseload standards and may potentially violate professional ethical rules. And clients and judges alike are frustrated with the lack of assistance they are receiving to deal with these issues in their local jurisdictions. There are several key factors that contribute to this crisis. First, we have no control over the volume of cases that come into our system, and that's going to be very important when I come around to the specific budget requests that we have to talk about. And that's because obviously what the legislature determines to either criminalize or specifically to make a felony is up to the legislature. And then of course the actual charging decisions of what to charge is entirely up to the discretion of local prosecutors. In fiscal year 2022, bids lost 1 out of every 5 public defenders due to low pay. That is another contributing issue. While over time we have been able to work on trying to alleviate some of those pay issues, we are still significantly far behind on those pay issues. And as a result of that, continuing to recruit into offices is difficult. We've also, contributing to this crisis is also the fact that we have an aging population of attorneys who are retiring and not being replaced by a local counsel coming out of the law schools. And so as a result of that, like when we're doing recruitments, we've had to really expand our recruiting efforts outside of the state of Kansas in order to get sufficient numbers of attorneys to even bring in. Another factor, of course, is the actual lack of staffing. The truth in our public defender's office, the fact is that even if all of our positions are completely filled, we are still understaffed for how many cases that we have. I can't force private counsel to come to Kansas and open up a private law firm and hang a shingle out and start accepting cases. What I can do is if I have the FTEs to hire, I can recruit people into our public defender's offices. but hiring public defenders continues to be difficult if I either don't have the positions to hire or the pay issues continue to deter people from taking those positions. Obviously, we also still have ongoing low private counsel rates. The legislature has made a huge difference in the assigned counsel rate over the last few years, but it is still significantly lagging behind even competitive appointments panels like our federal appointments panel. 84% of all adult felony level criminal cases require appointed counsel in Kansas, and so as a result of these problems, it is quickly becoming untenable for us to continue supporting the criminal legal system in Kansas. We need some much needed decisive assistance. So let's talk about the actual budget priorities. During this legislative session, there are several priorities that we have put together in order to aim at addressing many of these issues. First of all, we desperately need to maintain much of our reappropriations funding for fiscal year 2025. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail here in a second. But without that funding, we will not be able to pay our private appointed counsel and many of our death penalty defense-related experts and other counsel. We also need to avoid any cuts to our services in fiscal year 2026. For that reason, we're asking to be accepted out of the proposed reduced resources budget. And I'll talk about that and what the consequences of that not being accepted out of that would mean here in just a second. Third, we've requested 2 actual enhancements for fiscal year 2026. Oops, too fast there. Including the $6.7 million support for pay parity with prosecutors in order to continue to retain our current employees and be able to continue to recruit new employees, and then the additional 29 full-time employee positions that we need in order to fill our public defender's offices and make a little bit more of an effort towards trying to get those ethical caseload requirements. So, talking in more detail about our requests. So admittedly, bids did carry over a significant amount of reappropriations from fiscal year 2024 into 2025. As Molly said, this was due to several factors, including one-time cost savings from unfilled positions in 2023 and 2024 as a result of the massive turnover rate that we suffered in the spring of 2022, which required a substantial amount of time and effort in recruiting to overcome and fill those positions. There was also the impact of the funding of 2 new public defender position offices in the 29th Judicial District and the 11th Judicial District, which took time for us to get off the ground and get hired and funded. Our Wyandotte County office is already open and operating and taking cases. Our one in the Crawford County area is going to be open later this year. But because of the time that it took for us to open that, we did have some carryover from those funds from 24 into 2025. We also had some one-time cost savings from vacant positions in 2024 because our actual hiring process for public defenders takes almost a year from start to finish between when we hire somebody before they can actually start. And that's because it's so competitive right now for us to be able to get new public defenders hired that we are offering them positions and then having to hold their positions when they are in their 3rd year of law school. And so they do not start until the following year. So there was some cost savings associated with positions that have now been filled, but we were holding those positions for those candidates while they were finishing their last year of law school and taking the bar exam and all that. So that was why we had so much actual carryover. In an effort to be fiscally responsible, we did try to allocate that funding in particular places as part of our caseload consensus conversations in October with the Division of Budget and KLRD. We knew we were going to be short on our assigned counsel funding for fiscal year 2025, and so because we did have a significant amount of reappropriations money, we did agree to move money from operations into our assigned counsel to cover that cost so that we didn't have to ask for additional funds from the legislature for fiscal year 2025. So we transferred $1.7 million on top of the carryover funding that was already in that fund to cover those anticipated shortfalls of assigned counsel funding. Likewise, we also anticipated that we were going to have shortfalls in funding in our capital litigation area because of a significant number of trial, appellate, and habeas litigation that's happening during this fiscal year. And so as a result of that, we asked to transfer $2 million over, a little bit over $2 million over into our capital funding in order to support those shortages so that we can continue to pay those capital litigation costs. Likewise, we knew based on our funding over the last few years that we were also going to be short about $2.2 million in our experts funding. So experts are going to be medical experts, are going to be forensics experts, are going to be investigators for cases, that sort of funding. We knew we were going to be short funding in those areas, and so we rebudgeted our reappropriations to help cover that shortfall, and as a result of that, did not ask for supplemental funding this year for those particular funds. As Molly said, there were a number of other things that were also included in our reappropriations utilization, including additional rent costs for some of our offices that have expanded recently, which we've asked for in years past for either enhancement or supplemental funding and did not get those funds. And so because we had reappropriations funds this year, we, instead of asking for more money for this year, for that we included that as part of our rebudgeting. There were additional other things like IT security items, attorney licensing, software licensing. There was $300,000 that we negotiated to help pay for some of the costs of our Wyandotte County construction costs for our office there as part of lease negotiations, things like that, that those reappropriations went to. So that is all to say that part of the reason why you don't see supplemental requests from us in fiscal year 2025 is because we were trying to utilize the reappropriations money as opposed to asking for additional funds for supplemental requests this year. As a result of that, though, the reduction of almost $7 million proposed in House Bill 2007 would be catastrophic, particularly to the assigned counsel program, our capital legal defense, and our experts program, which is the bulk of where those costs are going. The thing to remember for our assigned counsel program and our capital litigation program and our experts program is that a lot of those funds are already promised, but they are still in the process of getting like the payments in. So people are already doing that work, and we've already signed like our experts contracts and all that kind of stuff, but not having the funds to be able to pay them means that we would have to hold claims. So the governor did recommend lapsing only $1.5 million as part of her budget recommendations. We are asking that we be able to keep all of our reappropriations money, but if the legislature wants to lapse any of it, we certainly would it would be less catastrophic for us to take the governor's recommendation of lapsing only $1.5 million as opposed to the full $7 million that the legislature suggested in House Bill 2007. So I'm happy to answer questions about that in more detail as well if necessary. Going into fiscal year 2026, we have grave concerns over the suggestion of a 7.5% reduced resources budget for fiscal year 2026. The reason for that is because we cannot accept a proposed budget reduction of that level without violating the United States and Kansas constitutions. The thing you have to remember is we don't have any control over the number of criminal cases that come into our system, and those cases have to go somewhere. And when 84% of all adult felony level cases require appointed counsel, that's huge. We can't reduce our budget by the necessary amount of money without substantially affecting basic operations of the entire Kansas criminal legal system. Approximately 87% of our budget is dedicated to public defender employee salaries or assigned counsel attorney payments. Therefore, there's no version of a BID's budget that would trim 7.5% of its expenditures that would not involve in some substantial way a decrease or a substantial impact on our direct public defender employees or our assigned counsel payments. And the problem that we have is even reducing costs on one side of it is going to affect raising costs on the other side of it because those cases still have to go somewhere and be handled by someone, and we still have to pay for them. So it's important to remember, for instance, that like if we were going to try to impose some of this cost like on our assigned counsel or on our public defender side of things, that when held to the same ethical standards, a public defender office employee can handle the same number of attorneys at the same ethical level of hours per case, and still have a lower overall cost than what the actual assigned counsel would do for those same number of cases and at the same number of hours on those cases. And so offloading cases, for instance, from our public defender side of things to our assigned counsel side of things to make up for budget shortfalls on the operations side of our budget would just cause increases in our budget on the assigned counsel side. If bids isn't accepted out of the requirement to submit a 7.5% reduced resources budget for 2026, there are a few options for how we could cut that much funding from our basic operations. These are the options that we had time to consider. I will remind you, obviously, the 7.5% reduced request came out on Wednesday and we had to submit our testimony on Friday, so we had fairly little time to turn this around. And we're still in the process of looking at what our other options are. What I will say is that, first and foremost, ending the death penalty would significantly decrease our our cost of our agency. Approximately 11% of our budget consists of capital funding for less than what was 0.01% of our cases that are death penalty or death penalty eligible. While this is not an option that bids could unilaterally take, if the legislature were to pass and the governor were to sign a statute ending the death penalty in Kansas and retroactively converting current death row sentences to life without parole, this would obviously make it a lot easier for us to have a reduced resources budget in 2026. While I realize that is a long shot, budgets require the making of choices, and the legislature will need to decide if the vengeance of keeping people on death row is worth the millions the state spends on maintaining and using the death penalty year after year. Our other option is to do as was done a little over 10 years ago, I think, and that is to prorate our bids assigned counsel rate under the provision in 224507C2 from the current statutory minimum of $120 per hour down to something below that. I think we were initially calculating going back to approximately $95 per hour may be able to make up that significant adjustment that would be requested as part of this budget. However, that kind of an adjustment would likely lead to litigation over the constitutionality of the criminal public defense system, and would most certainly contribute to a mass exodus of attorneys from our already too sparse panels. A decrease in the number of attorneys on our panels will lead to wait times for the appointment of criminal counsel in cases, and likely dismissal of cases if those wait times are anything substantial. Other options, if we were required to reduce 2026 resources, would include things like hiring freezes and potential temporary furloughs for employees. But again, those options have significant impacts on our public defender office caseloads, and those caseloads then would have to go to our assigned counsel panels, which then increase the cost of our assigned counsel panels. So, given the late hour of the request, I didn't have specific numbers to be able to put up there for some of those other options, and we're still fully vetting what those other options might mean, but that's kind of what we're looking at for those potential reductions. Regardless of where those cuts may come from, however, the committee should be forewarned that there are severe consequences to failing to fund constitutionally required public defense services in Kansas. Those consequences include ineffective assistance of counsel claims, wrongful conviction lawsuits, legal malpractice claims, mass exodus of counsel from either our public defense offices or our assigned counsel panels, statewide litigation over the constitutionality of the public defense system generally, and widespread dismissals of criminal cases for constitutional failure to provide timely defense counsel. And this is not me being Chicken Little and telling you what could possibly happen. This is literally what we are seeing in other states like Oregon, where this is actually happening in real time. And they are dismissing large numbers of cases for failure to have counsel. Again, this is why we're asking to be accepted out of any attempts to cut our fiscal year 2026 funding for these constitutionally required services. But on a happier note, if we don't lose funding for 2026, we did ask for 2 enhancements. That includes 6.7 million for a pay scale adjustment for pay parity. This is similar to what we looked at last year when we came before the committee. Our salaries are about 28% below prosecutor salaries, and this would be a suggestion that would increase our attorney salaries by an average of 28%. It would increase our non-attorney salaries by an average of 10%. And it would help us retain our current experienced employees and continue to recruit into our offices when we do have shortages or vacancies. The governor did recommend roughly 6.7 million for approximately a 10% increase. Obviously, this is not the full request that we made on that, but certainly if the committee was willing to consider that, any progress towards better pay parity is better than no progress. I know last year we talked about a $3.3 million increase for pay parity, although that did not go through House appropriation. So I know you've looked at this before. And I do appreciate the assistance that we almost got last year. So we're asking for you to look at that again this year. Last but not least, we have the 4.2 million for our 29 additional FTEs for our current public defender's offices. As I've said several times, even with all of our positions filled, and I will tell you right now that we have 31 technical vacancies. 18 of those are already filled with candidates that just haven't started yet. We have 8 positions that we are currently hiring for. None of those include public defender openings. So if we, even with all of those positions filled, we're still going to need more FTEs to be able to work on addressing our caseload problems in our public defender's offices and stop, help to alleviate some of the overflow into our assigned counsel panels. So we asked for that. The governor did not recommend that. We certainly would ask the committee to reconsider that for this year anyway. I understand and appreciate the difficulty of attempting to create a balanced budget given all of the competing priorities that every state agency brings to the budget process, but there are only a handful of responsibilities that the state is constitutionally required to provide. An effective defense counsel for poor people accused of crimes is one of those fundamental constitutional responsibilities. This crisis in Kansas Public Defense Services has been decades in the making, and it's going to take sustained and consistent investment over many years to pull us out of this crisis. We continue to need substantial investments in our public defense services to narrowly avoid the worst case scenarios that I discussed here today. Our public defense system is the backbone of our entire criminal justice system, and quite literally there would be no justice in Kansas without us. Last week, every representative and senator took an oath of office swearing to support the Constitution of the United States. When it comes to the Sixth Amendment and the United States Constitution, this is quite literally where the rubber meets the road. We would ask that you uphold your oath of office and then take the necessary steps that we've outlined here to support the Sixth Amendment and fund public defense. I hope the information I've provided is helpful. I'm certainly happy to stand and answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. So you'd mentioned your FTEs, and I know some of it lapsed due to vacant positions. How many are vacant today?
As of today, there are 31 technical vacancies, but 18 of those already have been filled because those are people who we've hired but just have not started yet, but they will be starting within the next year. Some of those are third-year law students who are getting ready to graduate and will start with us next summer. Some of those are people that are just starting over the course of the next few months. Right now, there are 8 positions that we have that are currently in the process of being advertised for, or that we're early on in the process of hiring. And then there's 5 positions that are currently on hold for that Pittsburgh office that we will be opening soon as we've got a little bit more confirmed lease space for that office.
Of those 18 that you are getting ready to hire, how many of those are you waiting for them to finish law school and things like, I guess when will those 18 start?
The last of them will be starting in August and September of next year. So usually for those that are first year, or those are third year law students, they'll graduate in May, they'll take the July bar. They usually start sometime after that July bar, so usually August or September. And then they are officially barred. Either they have a temporary license when they start with us, or they're officially barred like in mid-September when they get their bar results back. So that's the last of those will be officially onboarded at that time.
Okay. Any other questions for Representative Resman?
Thank you, Chair. What's the starting salary?
Right now, our starting salary for public defenders is $62,500. Starting salary for a comparable new hire, fresh out of law school for like the Attorney General's office is $80,000. 80, roughly, yeah. Some of them I think are a little bit higher maybe. And that's pretty comparable of most prosecutors' offices. Some are a little bit lower than 80, some are a lot higher for those starting salaries. And then there's a few offices that have started offering things like, you know, they may have a starting salary of $80,000, but they're offering $10,000 signing bonuses that we can't do or compete with. So some of that's also happening.
Any further questions for the director? Representative Weigel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation. In the last, let's say the last 24 months, how many death penalty cases have your agency worked?
All 37. I mean, that's one of the difficulties of the death penalty is those cases continue to go on and on and on. So even those individuals who are currently on death row who've completed their appeals, for instance, still have capital habeas at the state level that they're going through. So our offices work all levels of those cases. And so those are all ongoing.
So that's an ongoing thing.
Right.
Okay.
That's one of the reasons why, quite frankly, that's one of the reasons why the retroactivity of any death penalty litigation has a significant impact on the actual cost, because obviously the retroactivity provision of any death penalty litigation that would get rid of the death penalty would have a much higher cost effect on our services if we're not having to continue litigating the cases that have already been convicted. Does that make sense?
Well, I was looking at your statement, or one of the things that you listed was eliminating death penalty cases in the state. Aside from the fact that that's a major shift, what kind of money is the agency then looking at that they would recoup or wouldn't have to expend on defense?
So currently, we're budgeting between $5 and $6 million a year on capital defense and that's per year. So if we were not going to have those cases going forward, there would be some small cost. I mean, like for instance, if you were going to have a case that normally would be charged as a capital case, but instead the death penalty wasn't available, it would probably still get charged, but it would get charged probably as like a first-degree premeditated murder case, which there's still some associated costs with litigating at trial a case like that or doing an appeal, but that is a fraction, a very small fraction of what it actually costs for the death penalty litigation, because there are substantially more significant standards that have to be upheld with death penalty litigation when you're trying to ethically represent death penalty clients. So, yeah. So there would still be some cost, but it would not be as high as what it is, for sure.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Delberding.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You went through this. I assume we're working off this budget paper here, but in your slide, and I don't have a copy of that slide, it's not privy to me, but you'd commented a few times that you were looking for governor's recommendation, but yet it does not show up anywhere that I've found on here. So is that a magical number, or what is this?
The governor announced recommendations last Thursday. I'm sure Molly can probably provide you the detail of that. We also, in our written testimony, did like a chart on, and I don't have it in front of me, but in our written testimony, there's a chart that kind of compares what our request is, what House Bill 2007 has, and then also what the governor's recommendations were, since those came out the day we were getting ready to submit our testimony, or the day before.
And then there is some reference to numbers in this document,
Yeah, that's fine.
but they don't match any numbers in this document.
So,
Whether it's 2025 or 2026, et cetera, I've been scouring through, and it's like they're not matching up anywhere, so.
we were using the numbers that we had submitted as part of our actual budget narrative and as part of the DOB's budget recommendations. So I'm sure that like our DOB representative and Molly and I can get together and make sure we clarify any of the questions that you have there. So
I'm just curious which numbers are real and
Yeah.
which documents not. And then I guess just a general question, if I could, to the chair, where it's got the agency, and then obviously LBC goes through and deletes a certain amount. It's up to us to go through kind of line by line and put it in there if and when needed.
That would be right, yep.
And I don't want to jump ahead or anything, so,
Yep,
okay.
we'll be doing that tomorrow.
That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you.
Representative Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Heather, for your presentation. And this is just a general question. The lack of public defenders, how, if at all, does that affect the juvenile offenders in the juvenile justice system?
So we do not represent juvenile defenders. Those representations are handled by the county appointments panels. They also have horrible shortages of counsel as well, because it is a lot of the same private defense attorneys who serve on like the panels for the felony cases and the juvenile cases a lot of times. So the juvenile defense is not handled by us. I will tell you, there is some movement generally to ask us to try to take on juvenile defense, which is a very long-term question, because that would require a number of things to change, like with our statutes and our regs and things like that, before we could take that on. But I know they have such shortages of counsel and difficulty with counsel on the juvenile side that they've asked our board to look at what that would take to consider taking that on, but that's not something that would be an issue for fiscal year 2025 or 2026.
So if I could ask a follow-up. So with respect to the hired counsel, then would it, is it safe to say that there's a certain amount then of competitiveness if we have the juvenile justice system that are looking for those, to hire those outside professional attorneys, as well as the indigent services portion of it? Does that come into play at all?
As far as like competitiveness for candidates for those positions, or for like, attorneys to handle cases?
Yes, for the attorneys.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the more cases that you have from something other than our adult felony list, the fewer adult felony cases you can take, because there's a certain amount of hours that you have to put into any case in order to ethically represent those clients. So there is some competitiveness in the sense that, if somebody's taking a lot of juvenile cases, they're probably not, even if they're eligible to take higher level cases, they're probably not taking a lot of our adult felony cases. I think the other side of that, though, is like when we're putting public defenders in our, or raising the rate for our assigned counsel or things like that, when you're drawing more attorneys to some of these areas where there are shortages, they're likely to do additional cases if they're not working in our public defender's office, where they have to just do our cases. But they're able to potentially service the community legal system in other ways in that area besides just our cases, like if they're on the assigned counsel panel. So there's sort of give and take between like competing with who's taking which of our cases, but also generally trying to improve the availability of counsel in various areas. Did that answer your question?
It did. Thank you very much.
Any further questions from the committee? All right, thank you very much, appreciate it. We will close the budget hearing on bids, and we will move on to the Abstractors Board of Examiners.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Julia Kofoid, and I am a legislative fellow with KLRD. And today I will be presenting the budget summary for the Abstractors Board of Examiners. I will note that Sean Herrick, the director for this agency, is in the audience with me today. I believe she submitted testimony, and if there is time, will speak after me and is also willing to answer questions from the committee. The first page of the budget summary has a table that gives an overview of fiscal years 2024 through 2026. The Abstractors Board of Examiners is composed of 3 individuals who are appointed by the governor and who are tasked with licensing and regulating individuals and firms that compile and sell abstracts of Kansas real estate. The stated mission of the Abstractors Board of Examiners is to protect the citizens of Kansas against fraudulent and improper land title transfers by ensuring that practicing abstractors are professional and reliable in their work products. I will note that Abstractors is a fee-funded agency, so the only source of their funds comes from the Abstractor Fee Fund. If you turn to page 2, I will begin the analysis for this budget. Figure 3 shows the SGF, all other funds, actuals, and the agency request. The agency is requesting just under $26,000, which is the same from the fiscal year 2025 approved amount. The agency does not have any reappropriations from fiscal year 2024 to 2025, and this revised request did not include any supplemental requests, and there are no other changes. If you move on to page 3, I will begin the fiscal year 2026 overview and analysis. The agency request is just under $26,000, which is the same as the approved amount for fiscal year 2025. The agency has no enhancement requests and no other changes for fiscal year 2026. If you turn to page 4, you'll see fiscal year 2027. The agency is requesting just under $26,000, and there is a $10 increase from the fiscal year 2025 approved amount. The agency did not have any enhancement requests for fiscal year 2025. The agency request does include an additional $10 from their special revenue funds. This is due to increased expenditures associated with computer programming and other supplies and materials. This $10 is offset by a decrease in other professional fees for fiscal year 2027. On page 5, you'll see a reference table which has the agency 10-year expenditures. And on page 6, there are special revenue fund tables including their ending balances and their fees. And I am happy to stand for any questions or go into more detail on anything.
Any questions for the analyst? All right, thank you very much. We will, does the agency? Any questions from the committee for the agency? All right, thank you very much, appreciate it. All right, well, that will close our budget hearing on Abstractors Board of Examiners. I do want to point out tomorrow we will have our budget hearing on the Kansas 911 Coordinating Council, and then we're doing budget recs on Board of Technical Professions, abstractors, and bids. And we are also going to add the 911 Coordinating Council. We're going to do the rec tomorrow as well. Other than that, if there's no comments from the committee,